Thank you for rejoining us for our afternoon, late afternoon, I should say, session, which will wrap up the symposium for today. Our first speaker this afternoon is going to be addressing the topic of people and people management in the parks. If you've been following along with the general structure of the agenda for the program, you'll notice that we've tried to provide a general framework to understand national parks, how they operate, the environment in which they operate. We've turned this afternoon, after Steve's wonderful photographic interlude, to science, its role in the national parks and management of the parks. We turn to the people question now, before hearing from the man who oversees these extraordinary places. And I should note, in speaking about the sort of structure of the program, that there have been a number of references to what the future looks like for the national parks. The program for tomorrow is designed to begin to address that. Questions about diversity, questions about different types of relationships between communities and parks. Potential impacts of climate change, and ultimately asking questions about are there opportunities for future growth of our national park system. So with that said, let me introduce Professor Matthew Brownlee, who's an assistant professor in Natural Resources, Recreation, Planning, and Management in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism at the University of Utah. His talk this afternoon is on the question of park visitation and resource management challenges, a subject that he's done a good bit of research in and has some insights to share with us. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Well, I'll start by thanking Bob and Jan and Kayla. I only have one presenter that I have to be in charge of, and I'm intimately familiar with that presenter. But they have to chase around a number of us, and they've done a great job at that. Also, thank you to the Wallace Stegner Center for hosting the symposium. So, America's national parks have a long and well-recognized history that involves balancing resource protection and visitation. And in fact, as we've heard today, that is part of the enabling legislation and the mandate set forth in 1916. To the National Park Service. And during this presentation, I won't make the attempt to recount the history of visitor management in the national parks in all its detail. That would only tarnish the previous work of great park historians and environmental historians. But instead, I want to describe the current cadre of visitor management techniques employed in the national parks and other protected areas across our nation. And ultimately end by relating some of these visitor management techniques to potential futures that are probable in the National Park Service. So America's national parks are home to many magnificent species of flora and fauna that flourished in park territories well before congressional designations. And in the past and still today, most of those species require very limited direction. And start here with the alpha female of the 8 Mile pack in the Lamar Valley of our first national park, affectionately referred to by the wolf biologist as 909F. She does not require park managers to inform her of when and where to den or how to love her pups. And as backcountry skiers head high, the pride of the Rocky Mountain National Park doesn't need to download the latest app to figure out when to move down in altitude to avoid winter's blustery blows. And the elusive ghost orchid require no instructions of when and how to display their majestic blooms in the private confines of North America's only subtropical preserve. The Bruins at Katmai National Park need no interpretive program about normative behaviors when spatial demand is high, nor do they need a complicated permitting system when crowds of fellow bears begin to detract from the quality of their own experience. Now, America's national parks are also witness stunning landscape and celestial processes that obviously occurred well before the Yellowstone Act of 1872 or the Organic Act of 1916. And these processes do not require park scientists or resource managers to provide direction either. Our star at the center of the solar system needs no ranger-led tour or reminder to set predictably every day behind delicate arch. And the more distant stars require no extra illumination from Park Service personnel to twinkle in grandeur at Bryce or Chaco Canyon National Park. Similarly, the ice caves at Apostle Islands National Lakeshore require no authorization from the superintendent to form and glisten above the great waters of the world's largest freshwater lake. But as Wallace Stegner reminds us, no Eden valid without serpent. And America's national parks do contain a species that requires direction and, at times, intensive management. Humans are often comparatively the fewest, have the least spatial dispersion of use, have the least length of stay of most species in a national park, but they tend to influence park resources and processes the most. I know, it's outlandish of me to say so, and how dare I speak poorly of our fellow citizens and park visitors, which I'm sure we all fall into that crowd. But with or without management, visitors tend to travel places outside of their own skill level, such as Half Dome at Yosemite, or concede to the allure of a helicopter excursion at Grand Canyon National Park. As visitors, we crowd into places we otherwise spend lifetimes trying to avoid, such as cold jail cells and dark, deep recesses of the world's longest cave. We have innate desires to get close to other species, even when that may be dangerous for us or for that animal itself. We often require extensive persuasion to leave only footprints and take only pictures, and extensive persuasion to refrain from secretly removing resources that a park was established to protect, such as the rocks at Petrified Forest National Park. And unlike that beautiful 909F female from the 8 Mile Pack, we tend to forget our wonderful lessons learned at a park and often struggle to transfer our new park behaviors and newfound knowledge to our home environments. So why does all this matter? Well, in some cases it may not. In Garrett Hardin's 1968 piece in Science, Tragedy of the Commons, he contended that our collective and individual use of common pool resources is only an issue when population pressures and resource use exceeds the resource base within an allotted space. Relatedly, visitor management is not an issue either, as long as people don't visit national parks in large numbers or congregate at attraction sites. However, since the turn of the century, our great leaders in the National Park Service have experienced the opposite. People do visit in large numbers, and subsequently, without proper management, many resources can be influenced. Resources such as soil, resources such as vegetation, and some park resources can become degraded to the point that they're ecologically and socially unacceptable. And generally, these impacts that visitors have, particularly to ecological resources, occur in an asymptotic fashion, where the highest extent of impacts occur in a relatively short period of time, sometimes as little as a few days. Even after management action takes place, marked here by the circle, such as the closure of an impacted site, the resources rarely return to a pre-impacted state. This asymptotic curve generally occurs regardless of the resource being examined, and although the severity of that curve varies across different ecosystems, it does not deviate largely from this trajectory. Now, beyond impacts to ecological resources, visitors can also impact their own and others' experience, which is often referred to as experiential impacts. The most well-known experiential impact, which I presume many of you have encountered, is crowding. But there's also other impacts to the experience of soundscapes and the experience of viewing night skies. These experiential impacts tend to detract from the conditions that most visitors seek, such as solitude or hearing natural sounds, or the feeling of minuteness as one stares at the vast and distant night sky, realizing that we're only a speck of dust in the basement of the universe. Now, historically, visitor management meant manipulating resources for the enjoyment and attraction to keep visitors entertained, concentrated in one area, and content. For example, primary resources were directly impacted to please visitors and create attractions such as the Wawona tree at Yosemite National Park. And although the Park Service has never strongly advocated for the feeding of park animals, even Stephen Mather, the first director of the National Park Service, was known to feed a bear or two while visiting Yellowstone. The firefall at Yosemite National Park was a particularly famous visitor attraction due to its grandeur and the opportunity for a number of visitors to view. As if Yosemite's not impressive enough, a large fire was built each night on top of Granite Point, and onlookers below would gasp in awe and delight as park employees pushed the embers towards a scintillating cascade down the cliff. Director Hartzog stopped the practice of the firefall, remarking that the firefall in that magnificent valley was about as appropriate as horns on a rabbit, and it should not be there. Unfortunately, the impacts of these well-intended visitor management techniques also well exceeded the benefits. But visitor management has changed drastically. And as Bob Kiter states, the only constant in our national parks, park heritage, is the reality of change. Change in how we conceive national parks, change in how we manage them, change in what we seek from them, change on the landscape surrounding them. He goes on to add that in the aggregate, these changes have affected not only our view of a national park, but our approach to nature conservation as well. And Bob, I would respectfully add that these changes have also influenced the meaning and the practice of visitor management as well. In contemporary times, visitor management has become an increasingly complex business, informed by best practices that are constantly tested and refined in the world's most extensive laboratory of national parks. Visitor management is often thought of as a supply and demand function with four main guiding strategies: increasing supply, reducing the impact of use, increasing the durability of resources or experiences, and often as a last resort, limiting use. Now, 6 main practices are often pooled in varying combinations with these strategies: information and education, site development, rationing and allocation, rules and regulation, law enforcement, and zoning. Park professionals are tasked with the enormous and daunting challenge of making effective and efficient management decisions that combine these strategies and practices in perfect harmony. However, visitor management tends to be a delicate dance that combines the art and science of management and is informed greatly by a manager's experience and a team-based approach that involves multiple disciplines through interdisciplinary work. Although only 4 strategies and 6 practices are often used, the combination of how and when these are used are seemingly endless. As visitor management techniques have changed over the years, the science of visitor management has also progressed steadily. Today, most park professionals rely on the best available sound science to inform many of their decisions. Park managers today and park researchers now study social carrying capacities, or how many people can be in a given area without feeling crowded, with computer-altered photographs and videos depicting varying conditions that allow visitors to determine and report their preferences and acceptability for certain conditions, and when conditions may exceed their desires. The mean scores of these types of studies of hundreds of visitors are displayed as what we call a social norm curve that helps managers identify desired conditions and standards for management. You'll notice on the x-axis, those are simply the photographs that appeared before, and the acceptability rating, 4 being extremely positive at the top end of the y-axis there. We could say from this that regardless if you're a wilderness visitor or if you're a day visitor and you're at Dungeness Ruins in Cumberland Island, your preferred condition is near solitude. However, there's an acceptable range of conditions that fall here for both of those user groups, day visitors and wilderness visitors. And once conditions tend to exceed approximately 20, then the visitor standard has been exceeded. So why does this matter? Well, it helps managers determine how many people should be on that park shuttle, how many people should be dropped off at Dungeness Ruins, how many visitors should be picked up, and when quality of an experience may be decreased. Park managers and researchers also use time-lapse photography to identify current densities and frequency of use across days, weeks, and seasons at attraction sites and parking lots. That helps answer questions about how current practices, transportation flows, size of parking lots, and other infrastructure are influencing current conditions. Visitors often volunteer to engage in what we call GPS visitor tracking studies, where they carry small GPS units about the size of a flash drive to help researchers and managers identify where and when people travel on certain trails, how much time they spend at attraction sites, who stops at interpretive signs, how long they spend at the interpretive signs, and when they trample off trail instead of following designated routes. This helps managers understand the densities for use for particular groups of visitors in specific areas and how travel patterns may differ between different groups. Researchers are also using new micro camera technology such as GoPros to capture visitors' experiences from the visitor perspective. For example, this winter, visitors were intercepted at Snow Lodge at Old Faithful in Yellowstone and asked to record their experience throughout the day. Visitors that opted to participate in the study captured their experiences throughout the day, brought those back to Snow Lodge in the evening. They were uploaded to a laptop and used as the basis for university researchers to interview them about their experience, their place-based connections, and some opinions about management and potential improvement. Park managers and researchers use complex behavior modeling that helps predict who is likely to perform an action, such as donating money to grizzly bear conservation or supporting management actions, or who's going to purchase items at the visitor center after a tour on the Denali Park Road. All of these kinds of data can be input and often are inserted into simulation modeling software that helps researchers and managers identify how dispersions of use and the quality of an experience may change if management action occurs, such as changing and rerouting transportation, decreasing or increasing access, or building larger parking lots. Now, managers are gifted with this information, but their job is enormous. It doesn't tell them what to do. It gives them more information that informs their decision. They still have to make subjective decisions based on years of work experience and sound judgment. that lays within policy and abides by the law. I often ask our undergraduate students if they're sure they want to be involved in park management. And after assessing the challenge after years of coursework, they nod in positive confirmation. And I'm always in awe because every study I complete, I hand over the report and conduct a workshop of implementation, and a piece of me always feels sorry for the manager. So the future is always open for debate, and since we are at least hosted, at least in part, by Quinney College of Law, I thought it appropriate to rely on special assistance from at least one political leader. And like our democratic national park ideals and the future itself, Mr. Rumsfeld's credibility for assisting us in determining futures is probably up for debate. But regardless, in a well-known 2002 Rumsfeld defense briefing, he stated, "As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know." Well, I'm going to make a leap here and say we can extend the wisdom offered by Rumsfeld to the future of visitor management in the national parks. But don't worry, Director Jarvis, I don't think Donald Rumsfeld's looking for a position in the National Park Service. So the known unknown, or the known knowns of future of visitor management include a rapidly changing climate. We've heard that theme repeatedly here today. The one piece of information that I'll provide that is in addition to this theme is that rapidly changing climates will influence and are already influencing resources that visitors seek to experience. This includes viewing glaciers, witnessing migrations, or trying to figure out exactly when that ghost orchid in Everglade will bloom, or when that elk may bugle across Rocky Mountain National Park. We also have heard the theme today that U.S. demographics are changing and representing something less similar to past park visitors. Additionally, it's probably not news to this audience that younger kids are spending less time outside and fewer hours connecting with nature. Since you can now hike the Bright Angel Trail in Grand Canyon National Park using Google Maps Street View, technology will influence the visitor experience and visitor management as well. And if you don't believe me about Bright Angel Trail and Street View, just Google it. And you can hike the trail yourself. So these known knowns also lead us to the known unknowns. For example, although we know climate change will influence resources that visitors seek to experience, we don't know exactly how that's going to translate into visitor behavior. And we do have threshold analysis studies that try to help us determine how visitors will change their behavior as resources change. It is certainly an incomplete analysis. We don't know if displacement will occur because resources change. Or we don't know if visitation will increase because lengthening shoulder seasons. What will happen to visitation for a park named for a resource that no longer exists, such as Glacier National Park or Joshua Tree? We also don't know how our new America will care about or wish to use national parks, or if new generations currently disconnected from nature will become park stewards. How will visitors use, desire, and demand technology as part of the viewing experience? We don't know. Will Google Street View inspire people to actually hike the Bright Angel Trail, or will that only become a replacement for the actual experience? The unknown unknowns. Even Rumsfeld would say we simply don't know. However, when Stephen Mather took the directorship, there were many, many unknown unknowns. And the National Park Service has performed beautifully, balancing the enormous challenges of providing access and experiences with resource protection for now 280 million visits annually. I'm confident the next century of our beloved parks will be managed as equally as well as the unknown unknowns of the next 100 years unfold. We are in good hands, Director Jarvis, and thank you and other dedicated park professionals for their unwavering service to the public good. Thank you for your time today and this weekend. Go see God's beauty and visit a national park. And when you run into a Park Service employee, thank them for managing you.
Thank you. What did the researchers learn from the method you used with snowmobilers? What was their experience, especially their connection with place, and some feedback about management?
Sure. So I'll be very upfront and say that study just occurred this last winter, and we're working through the data right now. And as you can imagine, hours of video footage and then hours of interview certainly takes some time to work through, and we want to make sure that we're doing that in the ways that follow the best practices of science to provide information to managers. The intent of that study was to figure out really what are the contributions of winter to place-based connections. We know a lot about how people connect with place. We often refer to that as place attachment, place bonding. We have understanding of how to measure that and what dimensions are contained within that. But we know very little about what it is about a season, particularly winter. What is it about winter itself? The seasonal characteristics, the influences of weather, climate considerations. How does that influence? How does that detract or increase somebody's place-based connections? And that's really the thrust of that, and that was really the meat of the interviews that we were conducting. But as Gary talked about before, the combination of science in our parks really should be this mutually beneficial approach. And Destry earlier today mentioned partnerships that need to be mutually beneficial. And managers were certainly interested in the place attachment piece and found that interesting, but it was a bit of an academic endeavor. And it was important for us to make sure that our contributions were also present for managers, and so they were able to insert some questions in there about how certain trails and signage were influencing people's experience. That GoPro technology was also coupled with 2 different questionnaires that captured about 500 visitors each. So there's some, the study's a little bit more robust than what I presented. I'm sure that doesn't answer your question in full, but we just don't have the data worked through yet. Yeah, great question, and I think Joseph Sachs' seminal work is not lost. And if I misrepresented the research or management approaches, I certainly apologize for that. It's not my been my experience that researchers or managers in the National Park Service or frankly our other federal land management agencies are trying to design experiences that only concede to visitor demands, or trying to create experiences that only speak to satisfaction levels. That's certainly not the case. And the research that I presented here, just a snapshot of a number of studies that occur at our national parks across the nation, tend to be a little bit more complicated than what was presented here. And so I think that diluting it for the presentation perhaps communicated that it is only a service-oriented or service quality approach, and it certainly is not. I think managers are interested in gathering as much information as they can, and these studies only help them do that. Sometimes that information can be driven towards service quality. Sometimes it can be driven towards reducing or anticipating conflict around management decisions. There's a number of ways that that information is used. And I would say that most park researchers and park managers embrace Joseph Sachs' work, and that's very much still alive in the Park Service and managers and researchers' minds today. Okay, thank you.